welcome to Finders Keepers, and I have a very special guest today, Laetitia Barbier, who I think you're the librarian or the head curator, or I'll let you give your own designation and background in a second here. But first, let me just say the show is produced by Full Moon Films and getmansvirtual.com, and there's an upcoming antiquarian book and ephemera fair on, what is it, February 12th. It's normally the Greenwich Village Fair, and this year it'll be virtual. So for anybody tuning in, go to getmansvirtual.com. And without further ado, Letitia, just give me a little bit about your background, your title, and also how you got into our subject today, which is tarot cards.
Sounds good. So hello, everybody. I'm very excited to talk to Brian, which I love very much. So my name is Leticia. I live in Brooklyn. I've been in New York for 8 years now, and I am French. My background is in art history. I have a bachelor in art history from the Sorbonne University, and I've worked all my life, which, you know, I'm in my mid-30s now. all my life I worked in like culture to a certain and art to a certain extent. I've been in New York for 8 years. I've worked as the head librarian and the event programmer of Morbid Anatomy, which I run with my colleague Joanna Ebenstein. And we've been doing tons of things between, you know, exhibitions, books, tons of public programs, educational programs, classes, and yeah. And how did I go into tarot? I've been, so this is a very long story, so I'm gonna try to keep it short. I am French, so like in France, and we're gonna talk a little bit about the difference between the tarot. In France, the tarot culture is linked to the Marseille card, Tarot de Marseille, which is the traditional tarot we use for as a game, but also for divination. And when I was a kid, my mom used to drive me to school, and there will be around 4 p.m. there was a radio show about tarot where someone will read your tarot cards in live on the radio. And I remember being very obsessed by that show because I didn't know how to read at the time, and I was hearing all those like very evocative names, like, you know, the hangman or the tower reversed, and so like I was about 6, and all those images kind of built itself in my head. And later on, when I was 11, I found in the window of a tobacconist who was also selling games and card games and baccarat chess games, and I saw a pack of cards, and I recognized them immediately, and I was like, this is the witchy game. And so I've been reading for a very long time. I was not always good at it. I don't come from a long tradition of old witches. I have been reading cards as an amateur for about 10 years, and then like around in my 20s, I started to very much get into it historically, and then into the, you know, like the culture itself. And then very recently, I'll say within the past 4 years, I became like a professional tarot reader. Long story too, but because I got 2 readings from a psychic medium in Lilydale, which is a spiritualist community in New York, and also through the tarot reading of one of my friend's stepmom, who told me, both of them, which were about a year in between, told me, oh, you have to undust your cards again. You have to be a tarot reader. That's what you have to do. You know, like that's how things are going to work. And it's been very interesting since.
So what is the history of tarot cards? I mean, has it always been associated with divination and various practices of magic and witchcraft? I mean, the history that I've read online sort of links it to like this game or various European style card games that then got integrated into the occult in the 18th and 19th century. Mm-hmm. And then at some point it sort of became kind of a symbolic or archetypal picture of the universe itself. And then people are divided as to whether it actually has predictive qualities, or whether you're almost like an icon, just sort of recognizing certain things about yourself. But I mean, that's a kind of loaded question. Maybe just give me your
Like
sense about the history. Yeah.
so but I think, you know, like and I just love that this is, you know, like linked to, you know, like the antiquarian fair and like this idea of like collecting ephemeras, because the problem or the fun thing about card history in general is that they are ephemeras, and they are pieces of paper that people have attached no a little value or no value throughout the centuries, and so studying their history is very complicated. And the scholarship is fairly recent. It started serious scholarship about cards in general. Playing or divination card is like barely 150 years old. And so to make it short, the idea of playing with pieces of paper, a printed piece of paper, were probably invented by the Chinese around the 9th century. According to different scholars, although it's yeah, it's like it's hard to find tangible evidence. Card games were potentially, as we know them, potentially invented in Northern Africa during the Mamluk Empire, which is in Egypt. So the Egyptian had like a card game, which we call now the Mamluk deck, that had already those 4 type of cards: the cups, the swords, the wands, and the coins. And so from their trade with Venice, and then also from you know, like Northern Africa being connected to Spain and South Europe, the idea of card games came up and kind of invaded all around Europe. Tarot was invented in the 15th century in Italy. Italians loved games, and so they decided to create this new game with one more suit, a suit of 22 cards that were supposed to complexify the game. And so from the 15th century on, tarot developed as a card game all around Europe with like different, you know, poles and areas. And not only tarot, but other type of games that are have that 5th illustrated suit called the Triumphi, the trump cards, Minchiari, and other type of decks. And so game circulates, and there is, you know, like here and there strange little happenstance about like their potential link to the occult. The idea being that although there is no there is no tangible evidence that they were used as a divination tools, there might be a secret history of cards and tarot used as a divination tool. But historically, the first time someone said tarot is a repository of occult knowledge is in 18th century France. And that man is named Antoine Courte de Gébelin. He was a pastor and a Freemason. And he wrote that very famous book called Le Monde Primitif, which is kind of an encyclopedia. And in that book, he said that one day he saw people playing with the tarot, and in that suit of cards, the major arcana, the 22 Triumphi cards, he instantly recognized knowledge from ancient Egypt. And the fact is, you know, 18th century, there were no translation of the hieroglyph. So anything that was linked to ancient Egypt was linked to you know, like their profoundly complex esoteric system they had. And there was something kind of cool of imagining, you know, cool and exotic about imagining Egyptian hermeticism as like, you know, like mysterious and, you know, so basically that's the premises of tarot, divinatory tarot. After that, it kind of jumped up. We have like a man called e.waite, who's the French as well, who start to create card decks that are specifically created for divination, mostly cartomancy, but then he developed his own system. And then 19th century, it's the golden age of card as for divination, because in France, at least, we have a very famous cartomancer, Madame Lenormand, who becomes, you know, like who supposedly predicts the death of many of the French Revolution people. She also predicts tons of stuff for Napoleon and the Empress. She becomes like a complete celebrity in France. And when she died in the mid-19th century, a lot of card makers are gonna use her name to brand decks of cards that are used for divination. So all those games, like the small Lenormand, Grand Lenormand, all those were not created by her, but they were branded as divination deck, that woman, like, you know, the people, us, you know, the folk, you know, it's like parlor divination we could use. Well, and then from that point, decks are going to be created solely for the purpose of divination, culminating, I think, early 20th century with the Rider-Waite Smith, which was created, conceptualized by Arthur Edward Waite, member of the Golden Dawn, and drawn by Pamela Coleman Smith, was also a member, and probably, you know, kind of like, who channeled all these incredible images that people know linked to the tarot today.
So you brought up a lot of different ideas that are, you know, kind of coming back into the, sort of the framework of collecting and curation. And I guess some of the ones that really stand out to me is, you mentioned the Egyptian symbology, or the Egyptian imagery, the fetishization of Eastern mysticism and Orientalism of the 19th century. And also, you mentioned Freemasonry, and you mentioned the Order of the Golden Dawn, and some of the spiritualism and the occult that was happening in the 19th century. And in some ways, I think about the images of surrounding, like, Aleister Crowley's work, and I know he had his own deck, own tarot deck, but also maybe some of the stuff from, like, Hilma af Klint, or is it Olga Frobe, that our friend Stephen Romano found all those amazing prints from the Art Deco era. I mean, in some ways, those kind of remind me of the elemental cards from the deck. So maybe you can kind of, like, set the stage a little bit about why the 19th century was sort of the golden age. You know, what was kind of like in the air at that time? What was the zeitgeist that would have produced this?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I'm not like a, you know, I'm not an expert in this, but I talk about it in one of the class I teach. There is a card, which I found very interesting in the tarot. It's the Pope card. The Pope card, because the Pope card changes, has been replaced a lot in time, starting in the 19th century in France and in all other decks. And sometimes it's replaced by Jupiter, you know, like a kind of a mythical figure. And then sometimes it's replaced by a completely different idea. And so there is, for me, there is this idea, because of the French, you know, because of the revolution, you know, not only the French Revolution, but like the idea of, like, the pivot between monarchy and, you know, like, republic, democracy, because of Napoleonic War, and the fact that, you know, like, basically Napoleon goes in all these places trying to invade them, and then change the profound identity they have, like, especially, you know, Germany. There is like a regain of, well, there is a regain in this idea, like, what were we before Christianity? You know, like, a lot of countries go through that phase of, like, where was it before? And so in Germany, it translates through, like, Romanticism with, you know, like the you know, like Wagner, for example, and this idea of, like, you know, like the great myth of Germany. In English, it happens as, you know, in England, it happens as well. It happens in Northern Europe, where people start to investigate their pre-Christian past, and then you know, like the mythos around it. So there is that, and there is also the fact that 19th century, there is a, you know, like, the rational thinking has been completely established, and then science start to gain more and more terrain. And so at some point, the idea of spirituality, which is evoked in the Pope, you know, like this idea of, like, a spiritual authority, loses so much consistency in Europe at that time. And somehow there is a, if not a disdain, like a suspicious idea toward monotheistic religion. And a lot of people, a lot of intellectuals are going to start to kind of develop an interest in other ways. And you know, one of them being, you know, like, starting to, and, you know, enter in, forming esoteric circles and things like that. And the tarot comes as, like, a perfect tool, you know, because it is, you know, like, it comes with all this lore. It's very heavily illustrated. There is, you know, like, you can speculate so much about it. And one of the things that, maybe I'm going to get chastised for saying this, but it's true though, 18th and 19th century, everybody believes they have the definitive answer about what those cards mean. And then starting the 20th century, we start to understand those as more of like mirrors, mirrors of the soul, things that we can either project meaning onto, or that allows us to awaken meaning within us. But 18th and 19th century, this idea of the major arcana, the illustrated sequence of images, is very much a portal allowing to understand a doctrine, an occult doctrine, and so everybody's going to reclaim the cards in a different way. And I think, like, I don't think there is, it's either bad or good. It's just like it becomes very interesting to study how those meaning evolved, like for a card like the Pope evolved in such a drastic way, like it used to be the Pope, and then it turned into the Hierophant, which is linked to the illusion mystery, the Hierophant becoming more of a translator of the sacred words. And then, in some cards completely replaced, some card it's been completely deconstructed. There is one card from the 19th century, which I'll send you, which I love. It's like from a deck called the Soprafino deck. It's a very, very gorgeous deck. And you see the Pope as like this opulent, rich man with like all these like beautiful fabric around him. And then usually the Pope is depicted with like two monks praying in front of him. But like on that card, there is one more. There is a third monk, and he's dressed all in black, and he's depicted as kind of looking toward us. And when I look at this card, of course, this is complete poetic speculation. I think about like, okay, for me, this guy who's turning his back toward the Pope and looking at us, he's like a Nietzschean character. The deck is created at the late 19th century. The guy is here to announce that, God is dead. And at some point, that figure of the Pope is going to lose the hegemonic power they have upon our spirituality, how we define ourselves spiritually. That's my answer.
Yeah. So are there specific decks that you are like super attracted to, that you find to be kind of seminal in the history of moving things forward? And then maybe, as another question, or moving into the next thing, it's like, what immediately comes to my mind is sort of this revival after the 1920s and after the two world wars. It would be like in the 60s, when you start to see figures like the Fool winding up in like the Beatles Magical Mystery Tour album, and a lot of the stuff that was actually done by the art collective The Fool, and that kind of thing sort of re-entering. Maybe this this need to, I don't know, find an alternative to so much sort of rationality that led to the atomic bomb, that led to, all these nations who seemingly were, had their rational faculties and had sort of defined themselves according to these ideologies, and it didn't work out so well. And there was something that was maybe ancient that was still missing, that then became relevant again to that generation.
So it's just so interesting, for me, like if I have to define what the tarot is as a tool, like in a very 21st century way, how I perceive the tarot right now, for me, it is a tool that allows for re-enchantment. And I think, like the reason, and I will talk about that later a little bit, but I'm not going to go there too fast. But it really allows, because like it is a repository of beautiful images that are so evocative and evoke something very profound within us. And so, like I was going to say, like if I have to choose a historically relevant deck, there is lots of different deck. The thing is, like the one I gravitate towards, like what I want to say is that I'm not the way I love those decks is very personal, and so doesn't mean that because I love them that they're specifically historically significant. But of course, like the early Italian tarot, there is one at the Morgan Library, the Visconti Sforza, which is probably the one of the earliest tarot deck created. The cards are beautiful. They were commissioned for and by the aristocracy. So we're talking about like beautiful golden leafed card hand painted. Those decks are beautiful. Like there is a couple in the US actually at the Carrier Library as well, the Beinecke Library. Those decks are just beautiful. They are incredible. They are incredible, and they're still fueling, like it's very funny. They're still fueling the imagination, because apparently Dior came up with like a collection like 2 days ago, like a new collection of fashion inspired by those 15th century Italian decks. So it's still, the imagery can still capture our imagination. So those decks are beautiful. I have a preference, although I'm not an expert in that deck, for a 15th century Italian deck called the Sola Busca, which I can show you. There's a great book about it, which seemed to be it's like it's one of the first deck that is absolutely complete from that time that we have. There is always a couple of cards missing. This one is complete, and the iconography is just completely aberrant. You know, like apparently it has some link to like a kind of Saturnian occult practices, which I'm not super versed in. It's just but it's just completely completely incredible. If we go forward in the history, the thing that I really love are usually 17th century, 18th century printed deck, like the French early Marseille example. I'll say, you know, a deck like the Vieilleville deck, which I really love, which is kind of something on its own. What's the so-called anonymous Parisian tarot, which are those two decks are like very interesting because they come before the order of the images, or the iconography is very much cemented or, you know, crystallized around like one format. So the iconography is slightly different and slightly more bizarre. And there is this one card, I think it's in the Tarot Parisien, of the lovers, you know, and the lovers are kind of like embracing, but they're also like very close and touching each other in a way that I found very carnal. And so that's not something that you see neither in the Marseille nor in the very ethereal Adam and Eve. There's something, you know, there's something a lot more sensual in it. And I'm thinking about this when I think about those cards. I think about that's the deck that was created for people to play and drink in taverns by candlelight. And so they wanted images that were maybe raushy and dreamlike and evocative, and then linked to, you know, like a passionate perception of the world. And I just like, those are my favorite.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I want to come back to the idea of why this has become relevant, but I wanted to touch on one thing that you had said, which, you know, in the early sort of handmade decks that were created for the aristocracy, and then in the era of print, the iconography reminds me a lot of sort of late medieval or late Gothic prints by like Albrecht Dürer, or some of the house book illustrators, where you have vignettes actually on the page that are supposed to, you know, depict village life, but also touched by certain spiritual elements, where there's something in the sky, and then there's various little scenes from village life in Germany or in Holland or whatever. And then that late Gothic style, because it is so enchanted, as we start moving more into like neoclassicism and then, you know, Enlightenment, and things are getting more, you know, austere and more realistic in nature, it seems that that late Gothic style kind of merges into the alchemical style of the 16th and 17th and 18th century. And in a way, it kind of feels like, maybe I'm wrong, the early card depictions, like, do we know any of the people that actually created, do we know their names or any of their other work? And so is there a real link to late Gothic and alchemical illustrations that would sort of cement this lineage into the creation of the cards?
So
Maybe I'm grasping at straws.
very interesting you say this. So like, if we take the example of that Italian deck that I talked about, the first one, the Visconti Sforza, it is attributed to a painter named Bonifacio Bembo. And it's attributed to him because at that point, he had produced a bunch of portraits for the Visconti family. And so people have looked at the card, it's a art historian, I've looked at the card and thought, oh, you know, like the design seems the same. So it's either him or his studio, the people from his, you know, the people from their from his studio. I'm going to try to answer as concisely as possible. If you look at a deck like the Visconti Sforza, and in the format of the Marseille deck, the cards, the major arcana are depicting more or less the same thing. People in power, you know, the Pope, the Papess, the Emperor, not the High Priestess, the Papess, the Empress, the Emperor, and the Pope. People from everyday life, you know, the lover is kind of like, you know, it's a very domestic scene. The magician, the battler, which is a street magician, or sometimes you can see him referred as the artisan, you know, like he's making something. The fool, which is kind of the vagabond, the guy who's like at the margin of society. And then after that you have allegories of allegorical values. You know, you have the cardinal virtues, temperance, justice, fortitude, and all those, you know, like all those, for example, the cardinal virtues, they were very common, they were depicted everywhere. Dürer made a beautiful set of those, what's his name, Sebald Benham did a set of those as well. Those were images that were everywhere. So the origins, the iconographic origins of the tarot is probably not esoteric. It's probably almost like a kind of a microcosm of, and you know, like a macrocosm and a macrocosm of where we exist. You know, you have the people, the values, you have the planets, the sun, the stars, you have the things that we are scared of, the tower, the death, you know. And so like it is like a little composite universe, and it's not the only this idea of using cards to depict that was like a common occurrence in the 15th century. There is a deck that is like fucking amazing, that is not a divination deck, nor it is a playing card deck. It's called the so-called Mantegna deck, because for a long time it was attributed to the painter Mantegna, and it's basically like, and it's a series of prints that are showing cards. You know, they have numbers, they have and so, but those cards are showing basically the things that rule that rule and help us understand the world. So you have the 9 muses, the pantheon of the different Roman and Greek gods. You have the different how can I say that, the humanities discipline, you know, like the like scientific disciplines, and all those cards are supposed to basically give us an overview of the way we understand and appreciate the physical world. And so that idea of cards being used as a tool to allow to kind of like catalog the known world and the discipline that allows us to understand it is an old thing. Then one thing about the alchemical, there is no evidence, and I mean, I'm very interested in that topic. There is no evidence that there, you know, like there is no, like, let's say there is no satisfying, to me at least, there is no satisfying encoding of the major arcana as the great work. You know, like there is a lot of bridges iconography wise, and in the narrative of the major arcana there is a lot of correlation, but there is not one that is completely satisfying where you can just have the different steps. One thing I want to say is that the Visconti who commissioned probably the first tarot deck, the first deck with the triumphic cards, also, like, they had alchemical books in their library, and at that point in Italy, being knowledgeable about alchemy, like alchemy was not like a magical discipline. It was like a different way to understand the world at the time, where rational science didn't flatten the enigma of God's creation, basically, you know. And so,
opened it, right?
Sorry?
It was meant to open it, right? Like if
Yeah, absolutely.
If you were actively handling the elements, then you were going to be exposed to sort of the underlying element of it all in some way, and be able to actually work with that as a technology.
Yeah, and then there was this idea too, you know, which is like now, like, and again, I'm not an expert in alchemy, but I'm interested in it very much.
Yeah, me too.
There is, you know, like when I hear there is this alchemist in France that I really love. His name is Patrick Burenstenas, and he talks very often about, you know, like this idea of like speculative and operative alchemy. You know, like there is like two folds in alchemy. The fact that operative alchemy is the work you do in the laboratory. You know, it's the work you do on the matter. And then speculative alchemy is the work that happens within you as you transform the matter. And until the 17th century, this idea of, as I transform the matter, there is a realignment within me. There is some kind of a purification within me, and I become enlightened. That was like a given. You know, people used to not separate those two, and those two became separated, you know, with like the advancement of reason, and also in the developing of rational science like chemistry, and with like a rational cataloging. When when you pull the secret out of, you pull the sacred plug out of the, you know, the creation of the world. And so, well, I think, you know, like there is a lot of very interesting correlation. I think for me, and that's a very personal view that I share with a couple of people, there is definitely a link between the narrative of the major arcana as a sequence, you know, from the full card to the world card, because it is an allegory of you know, life, death, and resurrection. And there is an allegory of like matter being purified and then recomposed, but also understanding according to and I'm going to get a little technical here, going from a linear perception of the world, you know, life, death, just one single, to a cyclical perception of the world, where, you know, like things that are, to kind of paraphrase the Lavoisier, you know, nothing is lost, nothing is created, everything transformed. And for me, it's the tarot, the major arcana of the tarot really speaks about this, about like, at some points, things transform, and there is always a light after the darkness. You know, like it's just an oscillation between light and darkness.
And you know, with what you're doing, I've always had this sense that there's that practical element, but there's also that spiritual element, and also that humanitarian kind of joy I always get when I talk to you. So, you know, I love what you're doing, and I wish we could continue the conversation for much longer.
One day over drinks, I hope, whenever we'll manage to get out of our home.
Yeah, but this was really great. I can't thank you enough, and I'm sure it's going to be much beloved once everybody gets to watch it. So thank you again, Letitia.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Talk to you soon.